Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Policies, about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Lindi Ortega, titled Faded Gloryville. You know, considering how much indie country I cover, and especially on the Canadian side, I'm a little bit astounded that I've never covered Lindi Ortega before. Maybe it's just poor timing. Her last album, Tin Star, dropped in late 2013, where I was still very much getting a handle on these reviews. But let's make up for some lost time and discuss one of the more fascinating indie country acts that you'll ever hear. Born in Toronto, where I currently live, she spent most of the 2000s trying to land a deal through a selection of independently released albums and EPs, before signing with Interscope through Cherry Tree Records in 2008. And if you know anything about Cherry Tree, and a rising star affiliated with that label called Lady Gaga is perhaps the worst possible timing for her. It wasn't long before Lindi Ortega returned to the indie scene and signed with Last Gang. You know, the label behind Chaos, Lights, Metric, a bunch of other great Canadian acts, which proved to be a much better fit for her and gave her the flexibility to actually drop some good records. And starting with Little Red Boots in 2011, she did just that. Blending a dusty brand of alternative country with a vintage rockabilly image and jazz cabaret-inspired vocals, Lindi had a theatricality that might have felt a little bit broad if it wasn't for the great texture percussion and sharp writing. She followed around with a dustier snarl and general all-around awesomeness of Cigarettes and Truck Stops in 2012, which started earning her some serious critical acclaim, and for good reason, as Lindi's sultry vocals had a lived-in reality that belied the smoky glam and the dark lyrics. Lana Del Rey wishes she can appropriate vintage flair this well. It's absolutely stunning. She then followed it with Tin Star in 2013, working with producer Dave Cobb. And while he definitely brought his brand of vintage production that worked wonders for the atmosphere, I miss some of the smoky noir darkness and ragged fiery edge that was replaced with a gentler, more neo-traditional sound. And frankly, with Dave Cobb handling some of the production on her newest album, Faded Gloryville, I expected more of the same, to be honest. And of course it would be good, but it would reach the greatness that she hit with Cigarettes and Truck Stops. Would it be a great album? Unfortunately, it's not. In fact, I'd argue it's another step away from her best work and even lower than Tin Star. It's still good, don't get me wrong, but it's starting to seem like Lindi Ortega's more interesting years are behind her in terms of her composition and her writing, and a killer voice can only kind of excuse it for so long. In other words, it is good, again, but not great. So that's an admittedly a tough charge for me to make, and a pretty inflammatory one, so let's start with the obvious positives. Lindi Ortega herself. The woman has a gorgeous voice with a ton of charisma and personality, and while I do prefer her more fiery, rough edge cuts, she can handle the balance between theatrical personality and self-aware reality incredibly well. She's great behind the microphone. And considering how much more of this album delves into soul midway through with songs like the Bee Gees cover To Love Somebody, it's no surprise that she can absolutely nail this. What does kind of feel out of place are the backing vocals courtesy of John Paul White, the producer that handled the midpoint songs on this album. Well, it's because his presence doesn't fit the lyrical tone or the messages whatsoever, but more because he just can't match her personality in any way, shape, or form. She just overpowers these songs, and she does it in a good way, let's be fair here. Now this takes us to the first major shift in this album, the production. Much to my surprise, Dave Cobb only handled production on 3 songs on the back half of this record, including the album highlight, I Ain't the Girl, probably the best song on the album. The rest were done by Canadian guitarist and producer Colin Linden and by John Paul White, the latter who was one half of the duo The Civil Wars. And I might as well get this out of the way, I've never ever liked The Civil Wars. Finding much of their songwriting really kind of token and overwrought, and some of their production very lukewarm and tepid, really boring to me. Now to be fair, this never really happens with Lindi Ortega, for as much as her production maintains that burnished vintage feel with the liquid guitar tones fleshing out the background, with some sparse percussion and hints of an acoustic groove up front. What White does do, besides introducing his backing vocals, are some of the horns. And sure, it's kind of a cute idea, but ultimately it feels a little bit gaudy for me for these sorts of songs, and they don't really complement the organ all that well, which sounds great. Granted, the larger problem is that most of this album doesn't really move beyond some gentle, slow to mid-tempo numbers that have some texture, but really do enough to add a propulsive groove or snarl to the lower end to add a little bit more foundation. So the reasons I like Tell It Like It Is. Not only are the guitars a little bit rougher, that actually really works with their voice, but they add enough distinctive melody to support her. It's also why Dave Cobb's rougher, more country edges are such a better fit. Even if he's not quite giving her the same grit that he'd give, say, Sturgill Simpson, it's at least something to back her up. And hell, even the Bee Gees cover had a bass line with some tightness behind it that I did like, which takes us to the writing, arguably the area where this album stumbles the hardest. And I gotta be honest, the Bee Gees song is probably the least well written. Now, don't get me wrong, none of the writing on this album is bad, although that frying pan egg line on Run Amok feels imported straight from that terrible PSA from the 90s. That's just cringeworthy to me. But for a good half of this album, the writing just feels kind of lacking in the detail and personality personality that made Ortega's earlier work so striking and memorable to me. Part of it is a choice of the themes. Much as this album feels firmly lodged in its own place, resigned to living in that faded Gloryville where love will go unrequited, bad relationships will remain static or never evolve to real love or just fall apart naturally, and success just seems like a distant memory. Which, yeah, it's probably anecdotal and it can be a source of potent drama here, but this album doesn't nearly get its hands as dirty as Ortega has gotten in the past. Not bringing the same raw grime or self-awareness. Now, there are some shining moments. I Ain't the Girl shows Ortega genuinely regretful for breaking the heart of the straight-laced yuppie that she's just not that into. Even if he could provide her a more stable life, and especially considering that a lot of the guys she's drawn to in the rest of this record seem to be as reckless and capricious as she is, and she knows that. And yet, at the same time, we get more than our fair share of songs like Ashes and Title Track and Someday Soon and When You Ain't Home or even Run Amok that set all the stage for the drama for Ortega to do more, to move on from a bad breakup or initiate that breakup herself or even tell more of a story, and then nothing really happens. Almost as if she's resigned that things will never change, so why try and fix anything? And yeah, I get the resignation when it comes to her career a little bit more. So the title track works, even if it is a more abstract and honestly not quite as good version of Tin Star from her last album. But with relationships, it's a little shakier to get real sympathy from the audience here, especially when it doesn't really display a dramatic arc on display throughout the course of this album. After all, Pearl Jam only needed to write one version of Better Man, and it at least went deeper than some of these songs. Even Half Moon, probably the most lyrically developed song on this album, really is more for painting a picture of Lindi Ortega herself through the comparison. A good metaphor, one I like, but even then it feels a little bit lacking in dimension and real payoff to it. And that's when it hit me. The vintage production, the distinctive rockabilly and classic country vibe, and even style and some of the more simple songwriting. This is an album that on some level is attempting to recapture those old sounds and realizing it's not quite working in the way it used to. Ortega's gone on record saying that this album is about coming to grips with that fact, and you get snippets of that real insight and melancholy in her delivery, but the writing itself doesn't really support that additional insight and really provide a conclusive point for it. Mostly because we don't have those lyrical moments where she does pick up and move on. All of that leaves faded Gloryville stuck staring into its own mirror, a throwback desperately yearning for those glory days but never quite taking the step to get there or to move on. Now let's be fair here, it's a damn good look in that mirror, which this guy is getting a light 7 out of 10 from me, but I don't know, I can't help but feeling a little bit disappointed with this because I know Lindi Ortega, she can do better. If you're interested and more enamored with this sort of brand of atmosphere, you'll probably like this album, but let me misquote an excellent country album from earlier this year. Somebody long ago would have found El Dorado. So luck to you, cowgirl, but I'm moving on. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming up that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.